Salvis' Search for the Universe. Chapter 19. Brown felt his hot breath hit his face from inside the helmet. It was a feeling any soldier was familiar with, but now he couldn't help but notice it. Was he walking too slow? Too fast? Too stiff? He noticed anything and everything. What was he even doing? He was doing what had to be done, he resolved. He needed answers, and, most of all, he needed to settle his feelings. Tybalt had tried, but to no avail, so he was left with but one option. And now was the perfect time. The nobles were getting ready for the coronation tomorrow, and the guard down here was light. Brown passed through the open doorway and stepped into the basement. The click of his armor felt loud as church bells as he descended. He entered the dark and dusty room, smelling of moist dirt and wood. It was unremarkable in of itself, but for one thing. He spied it, the entrance to the palace dungeons. 2 guards guarded its gate, their uniforms perfect replicas of his. The iron gate seemed a recent addition. He sucked in a fortifying breath and strolled as casually as he could muster. The guards got closer and closer. They were looking at him, peering through the slits in their black helmets. He returned their glances, but no more than would be expected. Ignoring them would be even more suspicious. He was in reaching distance now. Their heads swiveled to follow him. He just kept walking like it was natural. He belonged here. He had every right to pass by. He kept walking until he was shoulder to shoulder with the 2 men, and passed, leaving them behind and out of sight. 2 steps, then 3. He let out a held breath and... "Oi!" one called out. Brown ignored him and kept walking. "Oi!" the guard shouted again, accompanied by rattle of shifting armor. Brown turned, slow but not too slow. "What do you want?" he asked indignantly. The guards held their spears at the ready. "Who are you?" the guard asked suspiciously. "Lars," Brown replied. He wasn't an idiot. He at least learnt one person they would recognize only in name. "Lars?" The soldier straightened. "Why are you coming down here? This ain't your place to be." He pointed away. "Git." "I'm here because they bloody told me to be. What more do you want?" Brown grumbled. The guards tried to speak, but couldn't get a word in. Thanks to those noble tarts upstairs, I've been walking up and down these bloody halls every day for 4 goddamn weeks, so they can drink themselves stupid without needing to worry about tripping on any knives in the dark. And now my cock and bollocks are redder than Sankt Marek's cheeks on Lambermas. I go and tell Morka that if I need to walk down one more empty corridor, my hopes of being a father are going to be in the midden, and he sends me down here. And now I've got to deal with you 2. Brown stared down the guards, his entire demeanor not that of someone who was nervous, but someone who was doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, and was annoyed at the people getting in his way doing it. They stared at him, gears turning, Brown threw up his hands in annoyance and turned around to continue down the steps. They did not stop him. Halfway down the steps, he froze. Gravel chills ran down his spine as he stared at the two white eyes peering from the darkness. The body they were attached to, blending with the black like phantom smoke. He hadn't noticed the man until he was right on top of him. There was something in those eyes, something more than he could describe. But his body understood, as if some primal fear suddenly had been awoken from sleep eons old. The eyes stared at him, freezing him in place, then sighed and flowed past. What felt like minutes passed by until he recalled from somewhere distant that he was, in fact, alive. He looked behind him, up the stairs, to see nothing but stones and shadows. He shook off the ineffable encounter and continued down the stairs to the dungeons below. Salvis stared at the ceiling. She was sore. She felt tired no matter how much she slept, but most of all, she was hungry. Peter was sitting in the corner, his feral eyes glaring from behind his long, oil-clumped hair. His unshaven cheeks were hollow, and his skin discolored from bruising and dirt. His face, which has once looked fresh as mother's milk, was now rugged as stone. Even now, something brewed behind his eyes, but whether it was hope or hatred was impossible to tell. As for Salvi, she had already given up. After their last stunt, the gods had stopped giving them food. That was a week ago now. Peter said that if they wanted them dead, they would have killed them then and there, and it was only an attempt to break their spirits. But Salvi was beginning to doubt his wisdom. They had run out of water, too. She didn't have the head to contemplate her own mortality, and preferred to take things as they came. But even she understood their situation, though there was some part of her that still expected some miracle to appear and save her like all those times before. The days and weeks had eroded it to but a grain of sand, but still it was there. A guard appeared from around the turn. Salvi didn't so much as glance as the guard approached, paused, and approached again, shocking her as he stopped in front of the bars. She sat up. Anticipation flared in her chest at the thought of food once again being delivered. But it was extinguished just as fast, for the guard held nothing. He stared at her for some time, then glanced left and right. But Salvi had no interest, and turned away to lay on the side in petty defiance. Peter remained in his own little world. "Salvi!" She started at the scolding, almost parental utterance of her name, and swirled around to realize she recognized that voice. The guard raised his visor, and Salvi's eyes gleamed at Braum's stern face. "Braum!" she exclaimed, and his craggy expression melted away like morning fog to concern and compassion as every word died on his tongue. Salvi grabbed the bars and stared, her tail wriggling with excitement. Braum stumbled back, conflicted, then grimaced and clicked his tongue. How can you look at me like that? You get what you deserve. He looked away when he had said it. Salvis' tail stopped and dropped, her eyes like glass beads.
Raum, not help Salvi?
Her quavering voice curled his lips and tugged at his heart. No, he replied. I'm here to... He was cut off, as a rugged man in the back extended to his full length. His head hung low, and his arms swinging intimidatingly loose. You... Peter pushed Salvi aside and grabbed the bars. You're not one of the gods, and Salvi seems to recognize you. Who are you? He asked, grimly. Braum didn't even notice him sitting in the back of the cell. There was no denying that he knew Salvi. He paused and decided that at this point there was no use in hiding. I'm a captain from the guard from Luhorn, serving under House Pharaohs. What I'm doing here is no concern of yours. It is now, Peter replied calmly. You are in no position to order me. Tell me now, or I'll alert the guards. Braum forced a laugh and tried to look comfortable in his uniform. Alert the guards? What fear have I of that? Don't take me for a fool, Captain. Since arriving, you've glanced over your shoulders to the mouth of the corridor 3 times. If you think you've got anything to lose from calling your bluff, you've got another thing coming. He gripped tight the bars. Now, are you going to reconsider your answer? Braum cringed. He hadn't expected the ragged indignant to be so observant. You're right, he admitted, grudgingly. I've snuck down here to question Salvi. She broke into Castle Farrell several months ago and stole something very important. That's why I'm here. His too familiar glance toward Salvi betrayed his claim. The pendant, Peter guessed, as Salvi protested behind him, saying,
Salvi not steal. Salvi steal nothing.
Braum's eyes narrowed. You're one of her partners, ain't you? Peter chuckled. No, I'm but Grand Councillor Manacle's assistant. My name is Peter Belvale. Nice to meet you, Braum. Braum looked at him skeptically. If you don't believe me, ask Manacle himself. Manacle is dead. Not yet, at least. He is in the 4th cell to the left of the stairs. Peter smirked and Braum looked utterly confused. So, you are not one of them, after all. Peter extended his hands through the bars. Braum reached for his weapon on instinct. But Peter's face was placid and held no trace of the wild cast from before, looking as proper as any nobleman of fine breeding. He squinted at the hand and shook it reluctantly, afraid to anger him. I'll tell you everything I know. Whether or not you wish to help us after hearing it will be up to you. Okay. Braum was still unsure what to make of it all. He glanced at Salvi, who was making eyes at him, and was urging him to help her more and more. Dangerous seductress that she was. The pendants Salvi stole. Salvi made a noise, and Peter silenced her with a finger. Saved, I would say. The pendant Salvis saved from Castle Pharos was something that Manakel was attempting to bring to Penaz, although he kept me largely in the dark about the whole thing. Braum nodded. He had heard as much when he was promoted to captain. Where you are mistaken is believing that Salvi and the human infiltrator are comrades. I've read reports of the incident, and I can tell you that Salvi is most certainly not with the man you have been chasing, or else she would not be in the cell with me. Instead, she was trying to bring it to Penaz, without letting it fall into Duke Rondo's hands. Duke Rondo? Yes, Duke Rondo is the head of all of this, though he likely has many connections within the council itself, as well as several assassins under his control. The pendant is integral to his plan to usurp the throne, though I do not know how. What is important is that the pendant is currently in his hands, and probably plans to make his move soon. The council announced the ceremony to choose the new king nearly a month ago. Noble families from all over are pouring into the palace, and the ceremony is tomorrow. Tomorrow? Peter chewed his lips. He sure didn't waste any time. He felt the weight of time pressing down. Anyway, Manakel was the one person standing between Rondo and his claim to the throne. Not long ago he raided Manakel's private quarters and captured him. I escaped the palace before they could get me too, and, as I tried to flee the city, I ran into Salvi, who was trying to get to the university, though she refused to tell me why. He eyed her. She may not be our comrade, but she is not our enemy either.
Salvi do nothing wrong,
she added, after soaking under both Peter and Braum's leery gazes.
Salvi just want out.
There we can agree. Peter nodded, then looked to Braum. Please, if you have any love for this kingdom, you'll help us. If this is what Rondo is capable of, then nothing good will come from his back on the throne. Braum drew his lips into a line as he traced his jaw with deliberative fingers. If everything he had heard was true, this was much more than he had bargained for, and what care had he for who sat on the throne? He looked at Salvi, and he sighed. I'll help you if I can, but...
Are you going to escape?
A fourth voice suddenly cried out, indignant, but raised enough not to travel past the corridors.
Not without bringing me along, ain't you?
Who?
That Branelcoff,
Salvis said flatly.
Don't give me that tone, lizard breath. It's your fault that I am in this mess, and you owe me to get me out of it.
Peter hissed through the bars.
You shut up if you want any hope of getting out at all. As long as we escape, we'll get you out of here once we've dealt with Duke Rondo. All you need to do is be patient. To hell with patience. I've had it with this place. I haven't even touched my loot in 6 weeks. You're going to bring me along. If you don't, I'll scream for the guards. As heir of House Canehorn, that's an order.
You pompous fool! Do you have any idea? Peter fell silent as Braum's hand sliced through the air. They all sank into their cells as Braum walked away without a word. All except for Salvi, who stared excitedly after him. Peter pulled her back in time for the real guard to pass on his rounds. Braum came back some 20 minutes later, looking every bit the disinterested and frankly dim-witted guard he was pretending to be.
Sorry,
Braum apologized in a whisper.
I've managed to convince them that I am an extra, sent here by the captain of the palace guard, but it's all a matter of time before they figure it out.
Salvi hungry,
She moaned.
bring Salvi food.
I can't bring you food. I can't leave until my shift is over. It would look too suspicious.
Braum shook his head as Salvi made eyes at him. Peter, was it? I hope you've got some brilliant plan to get out of here, because I'm not seeing it. I might be a soldier, but overpowering 3 guards is impossible. And even if I could, the only way out of here is that staircase. Even the greatest soldier could not hold off an entire army in that narrow space. Did you not say you were the captain? Raise your forces and storm this place. So long as we get out with Manakel, we can explain everything. Braum rubbed his brow. Look, it's true that I am a captain now, but I've only recently been promoted. And convincing even a dozen of them to commit treason is another thing entirely. It's not going to happen. Peter tapped his shin. Then tell someone. The patriarchs of House Denker and House Devon should be inside the palace. If you tell them everything I've told you, they might help you if it's to pull Rondo down. Braum shook his head. Even if I could secure an audience with the 2 most powerful noble houses, just how is this nameless soldier supposed to convince them to storm the palace dungeon? They are more likely to suspect some sort of trap, and I wouldn't blame them. It's the best option we've got.
You should tell my father.
Branelkoff chimed in.
Did you not say that all the nobility is gathering in the palace? Tell my father. He'll come get me.
Branelkoff, you said you were the heir to House Canehorn. That would make you Felix von Canehorn, correct? Peter asked.
Yes,
He admitted begrudgingly. So, you don't know? Peter sighed. Your father's been missing for weeks. At this point, it's almost certain that Duke Rondo had a hand in it, and it's not the first mysterious disappearance I'd place at his feet. Branelkoff didn't reply. How about this? Peter returned to Braum. If you can get us the key to the cell, we might be able to sneak out at night. They keep it pitch dark down here, and only the exit is guarded. We might be able to rush past them before they notice us, and outrun them. Do I look like a pickpocket? And besides, didn't you say you needed to escape with Manakel to convince the nobleman? How is an old man going to outrun several armed guards? Peter grimaced. He hadn't thought about that. Okay, how about... Salvi sat and stared as the 2 went back and forth. Peter presenting ideas and Braum shooting them down. They were both talking so fast. It was hard to keep track of what they were talking about. So she stopped trying. It was obvious the answer wasn't going to be simple. Branelkoff was smart, and so was Peter and Braum. They would think up something eventually. Humans were good at that, thinking of things. Or so she thought, until their conversation soared. Peter pointed his finger at Braum, demanding he give him an idea for a change. It only annoyed him more when Braum claimed he couldn't think up anything. He restrained his irritation, trying his best not to upset their only chance at escape. An effort that was kneecapped as soon as Branelkoff opened his mouth. He told Braum just to go fight the gods already, claiming that
was what soldiers were for.
And that
because he's captain, he must be pretty strong.
Braum looked ready to march out then and there, but stopped for some reason, looking at something in Salvi's direction. She thought it was funny, though. If Branelkoff wanted the guards to run away, all he'd need to do was play them some of his music. She tittered to herself, then stopped, her face entering a new dimension and uncharted spheres of inspiration.
Salvi have idea,
she said excitedly.
Uh-oh.
Branelkoff sneered, and you could almost hear his eyes rolling. Peter and Braum looked at each other, then back to her, unsure of what to make of it. Salvi puffed up.
Salvi have idea.
Okay, Braum asked warily. Let's hear it then. Salvi took a deep breath, like a bubble that was about to burst with excitement. Her face flickered as she almost forgot what she was going to say, but caught it just in time.
Give Branelkoff loot. Branelkoff play music. Gods run away.
She held up her arms as if expecting applause, but all she got was silence. Braum and Peter stared at her with a stupid expression, like they had actually become dumber from just being within blast radius of her mouth. Their brains malfunctioned as they tried to think of some sort of reply.
Well,
Branelkoff made an offended noise.
I'm sorry your species is incapable of understanding art. There's nothing wrong with my music. Everyone in town loved it.
Branelkoff, Braum groaned. Shut up! He turned his eyes back to Salvi and faked a smile. Thank you for that great idea. We'll keep it in mind. What about... Peter was already starting again. Salvi thrust her fists to the ground in a huff. She frowned at both of them.
Salvi serious. Salvi idea work.
Peter flapped his hand at her. Yes, yes, he mumbled, without breaking away. Salvi puffed up again.
Salvi idea great.
She protested, but got no reply. She was being totally ignored, and it was annoying her. Her one good idea, and the dumb humans didn't want to hear it. She vibrated angrily.
Bring loot or Salvi scream.
The two of them turned in alarm. Don't do that, Peter stammered. They tried to soothe her, but she wasn't hearing any of it. as she sucked in air and tilted her head towards the sky. She let out a squawk before Peter could wrap his hands around her mouth. But her angular face made it impossible to fully smother her as she waddled and buzzed through locked teeth. The strange sound filled the cell. Braum looked panicked, agonizing, as he wondered just how far these sounds were travelling, and they just showed no sign of stopping. "Good Lord!" Braum exasperated. "Why are you all trying to get me killed?" He threw up his hands in surrender. "I'll do it," he said with a resolute shout. "Salvi, I'll do it. I'll bring you the goddamn loot. Just please, please be quiet." He pleaded, and Salvi stopped. Peter and Braum looked winded, though they hadn't done anything. They sharpened their ears and heard footsteps. Braum stiffened. "I'll be back tomorrow. I'll do what I can, but no guarantees," he said in a rushed whisper, and was off. He winced as Salvi called after him, not to forget the loot.
"Ah, Duke Denker, greetings."
Rondo patted the big, bearded noble on the back.
"It's good to see you. Today is an important day, is it not?"
Denker thumbed some tobacco into his pipe and puffed on it.
"Took them long enough."
He billowed smoke.
"What do you think?" "What do you mean?"
Rondo asked innocently.
"Is the king's madness infectious?"
He puffed sardonically, unimpressed, his eyes veneered under layers of suspicion and doubt.
"You've lived in this palace for the whole past year. Surely you know something of the council's decision."
Rondo merely smiled at him, savouring the moment. He stood at the mouth of the throne room as nobles and their retinues filled in around him. They were all early. The ceremony was later in the day, and the sun had just come up an hour before. But with this many noblemen in one place, one would need to be an idiot to pass up the chance to play their games. It was what noblemen did best, and not one suspected that they were all pieces in his game. This was his moment, one he had made all for himself, and the feeling was incredible.
"Unfortunately, they are very secretive about their meetings. I've heard next to nothing about their decisions and deliberations, and I must admit that the name of the next king is no concern of mine."
Denker harumphed.
"Bloody councilman."
He puffed again.
"Why is it that we let some dozen lowborn decide the fate of the kingdom? It's absurd."
He narrowed his eyes.
"Are you suggesting that you wish to usurp the council's decision? Treason does not look good on you, Denker." "I said nothing."
He grunted and huffed furtively, but it was obvious what he meant. The man wanted to be king as much as Rondo did, so it was no surprise that he was willing to flex his muscles. The only problem, he was too late, and the ship had sailed without him. As much as Rondo wished for the kingdom to be whole when it was given to him, he wasn't the type to shy away from a little culling, and was more than prepared to deal with any house foolish enough to oppose him. Perhaps Denke's duchy would make a fine gift for Egertorn. Braum was calm. Braum was cool. Braum was collected. He measured his breath and approached the two guards at the entrance with his confident stroll. He carried in his left hand a black woven sack that bulged at the bottom. He could see the suspicion in their eyes. He reached into his sack. "Want a sweet roll?" He held up the baked delight and offered it to the guard. The intoxicating odor of freshly baked bread and the amber glow of drizzled honey was too much. The guard lifted his visor and took the treat immediately, biting into the flaky, soft dough as Braum offered one to his companion. Naturally, he accepted it. They chewed happily. Braum flicked his hand as if to say, "See ya," and walked down the stairs. Once again, they had not stopped him. Halfway down, he let himself sigh in relief and continued down into the dungeons. The guards chewed and stopped, mouths full and eyes wide. They swallowed painfully and saluted, red-faced and embarrassed, as the warden approached them with his own mouthful of questions. Peter looked at Salvi askance as she shot up straight, her face suddenly transfixed on something far away. He didn't understand until he saw Braum appear around the corner. Her eyes were locked onto his bag. Braum read her intentions perfectly. He reached into the sack and gave her a fresh, sweet roll. She swallowed it instantly and begged for more. He shook his head and gave one to Peter. She snatched it out of his hands and swallowed it before Peter could react. To her credit, she showed some remorse as Peter skewered her with a look of utter betrayal. But still, she didn't look like she regretted it. He forced down his instincts to throttle the kobold and choke her until she vomited, and told himself that something so sweet would only have made him sick after starving for so long. "So?" Peter asked Braum, who shook his head remorsefully. "They rejected my request for an audience." He rummaged around his bag. "After that I tried to speak with my commander, Sir Tybalt. It was a bit of a risk, but he believed me." Peter's eyes gained some life, and he regretted his careless use of words. But he said it was too much of a risk, and he could never face his father if things went wrong. Dark clouds hung over their heads. Braum pulled out something. Lockpicks. Like a consolation prize. He handed them to Peter. "I'm not sure if you can use these, but maybe you can figure something out." Peter rolled the foreign instruments in his hands, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more." He handed him a water skin, and Peter snatched it and drank it instantly, handing it over to Salvi. Once it was barely a fourth full. It was fair. He was going by body size, Naturally, he deserved more.
Didn't I get anything?
Brandalcoff whined from one cell over. Braum ignored him. I'll try and speak with Tybalt again. See if I can't do anything. I'm not giving up, but I can't get you out right now. I'm sorry. It's okay, Peter said, but didn't seem convinced himself. You've already done more than anyone could expect.
Braum bring loot?
Salvi asked, completely oblivious to the mood. Braum heaved a heavy sigh and revealed what was accounting for the vast majority of the bag's volume. Salvi brightened. Do you have any idea? A flurry of footsteps thundered across the stones. Braum cursed, dropping the loot and drawing his sword, as guards poured out from the dungeon corridor with weapons drawn, crashing against Braum like a runaway carriage. Salvi stuck her face through the bars and watched in horror as he fought just to stay standing. The corridors were narrow. He tried to run, pushing, shoving, and kicking them off as he retreated deeper into the depths of the dungeons. Salvi's shouts were lost to the sound of clattering armor and grunting men. Peter looked resigned. She looked down and remembered. She crouched and screamed,
Brandalcoff!
as she swatted the loot, skidding and spinning across the stone to land in front of Brandalcoff's cell.
What? What am I supposed to do with that? Hit them with it? Play music!
She shouted.
How is that going to... Play!
She screamed and covered her ears. Perhaps it was weeks of delirium catching up to him, but Brandalcoff leaned down and grabbed the loot through the bars, bringing it awkwardly to his chest, shouting confused and accusing protests as he attempted to play it through the bars. The instrument felt foreign after so long. He plucked the notes with shaking hands. The fight went on. Braum was surrounded now. He was on the ground and struggling, kicking and flailing, like an overturned turtle, as the guards tried to slip knives into his armor. Like recalling an old memory, his hands suddenly remembered what it was they carried, and his music took on his distinctive Brandalcoff sound, mixed with the grunts and shouts of half a dozen men. Salvi watched, waited, but nothing was happening. Brandalcoff was mostly confused, and more than a little scared. She uncovered her ears.
Other song!
She shouted and covered her ears again. Brandalcoff shouted something back she could not hear, but he switched his tune. His fingers flowed like quicksilver and shook the stones. His musical terror reverberating with the very darkness of the dungeons themselves. Salvi watched as Peter's eyes grew glossy, empty, and hollow. She clasped her ears tight, and soon their guards slowed, fighting like they were swimming in molasses. And then they stopped, freezing, stiff and still. Braum and the gods lifting their heads like plants searching for the sun, all turning to face Brandalcoff. He stared back, confused. His music died off, and his hands slowed. Braum, the gods, and Peter all blinked, shaking their heads as awareness once again crept into their heads. Brandalcoff stiffened and played again in panic. Their eyes glazed over for the second time. Brandalcoff squinted. He stopped, then started. He stopped, then started again. He watched as his dark, cacophonic tune stole their minds again and again. He smiled.
Ha!
He laughed cautiously.
Ha ha!
He beckoned one of the guards to his cell, and he obeyed.
Yes! Yes, come to me. Now unlock this cell.
He commanded, enjoying it a bit too much. The mindless guard prodded his keys with numb fingers. They fell to the floor.
Of course,
He sighed.
nothing's ever simple for old Brandalcoff.
Crouching, he reached for the keys, and the music stopped. The guard moaned. Brandalcoff's eyes rolled up to meet the guard's. He shot straight as the guard lunged and resumed his dark melodies. The lunging guard flopped to the floor. Brandalcoff groaned in frustration.
Give Salvi keys.
Salvi shouted.
Salvi? Why aren't you?
He asked, and got no reply. He looked at one of the guards, standing in the back.
You, yes, you. You understand?
The guard's expression was unchanged.
Walk over there.
He flicked his head. The guard did not move.
Come on, go over there.
The guard started to move.
Yes, just like that. Just keep moving and, for the love of God, don't go that way.
Brandalcoff screamed.
Go over there.
Finally, the guard meandered his way over to Salvis' cell. He bumped into the bars and continued to walk, grinding his face against the rusty iron. Salvi pressed her ear into her shoulder. She reached out with her newly freed hand, took the keys around his waist, and unlocked the cell. With one big push, she knocked the cell door open and sent the guard sprawling to the ground, where he remained. She skittered over to Peter and grabbed his hand. Humans were actually pretty heavy when they were as limp as a corpse. She lifted his hand to his head and pressed it against his ears, first one, then the other. Was it working? She stared at his vacant face and poked him in the ribs. He blinked and seemed to see his surroundings for the first time. His voice cut off as he let his hands fall away from his head. Salvi stamped her feet and put them back, this time holding them there as best she could with one hand. Peter woke up to see Salvi staring directly into his eyes. He jerked back. Salvi covered her ears empathically, urging him to keep his covered as well. He was dazed, addled, confused, but did as she told. Slowly his wits returned. He gasped, shouting in disbelief, seeing for the first time the cell door wide open. In the same breath, he noticed the guard quivering unnaturally beside the door. Salvi stepped over the man's supine body and out of the cell.
It's magic,
he whispered, inaudible even to himself. Peter joined Salvi and stared at the mindless guards in disbelief as he stepped into the corridors, noticing Branelkoff for the first time.
Could you please hurry already?
Branelkoff shouted.
My arms are getting tired.
Branelkoff's words could not make it past Peter's hands, and instead rumbled in his ears as he stared at the dishevelled nobleman, playing the lute like an absolute maniac through the bars of his cell. Salvi revived Braum in much the same way, and after the initial confusion, joined Peter to stare at Branelkoff. His arms were in the way of opening the gate, but he couldn't stop to let go of his lute either.
All you guards!
Branelkoff commanded, sweat beading down his face.
Go walk into the cell over there. Yes, that one. That's it. Keep going.
Salvi slammed the door behind them and locked it. Branelkoff's arms fell limp. He dropped his lute and panted.
Now, could you please get me out of here?
Salvi uncovered her ears. Peter and Braum copied her. Both stared at Branelkoff as Salvi unlocked the door. He strode out, his lip curled arrogantly. It was around now that the guards in the cell started to let out confused screams.
You're a black magician!
Peter barked in disbelief.
You! That House Canehorn is a black magician!
His eyes flitted to Salvi.
You knew about this the whole time? Black magician?
Branelkoff cried indignantly.
How rude! No, I'm a black magician,
he declared, his sardonic grin overflowing with pride of his newfound moniker. Peter stared at him. Branelkoff, I don't care if you're the devil himself. I'm just happy to be out of that cell. I'm happy to be alive. Braum shrugged. Branelkoff nodded smugly, his self-satisfied smile seeming to say he wouldn't stop them if they wanted to say more. And he was annoyed when they didn't.
Well, you're welcome. Thank Branelkoff!
Salvi stared up at him.
Ah, yes.
He patted the kobold on the head. Braum squinted at him.
No hard feelings and all that. I suppose it was thanks to your help that I was able to get everyone out of these cells.
Sorry to interrupt, Braum said sarcastically. We should get out of here before anyone else shows up.
Anyone else?
Branelkoff scoffed and picked up his lute.
You don't need to worry your little head over that.
He plucked a cord and smiled approvingly as the three winced, in fear of his power, of course. He's right, Peter stopped.
Manakel,
He breathed and dashed down the corridors. Braum, Salvi, and Branelkoff chased after him. The guards shouted expletives at them from inside their cage. Branelkoff skidded to a stop and spun with showman-like flair.
Not so fun when you're the ones on the inside. Now, is it, boys?
He jeered.
Eat shit, you wankers.
He thrust his hips and ran away, cackling maniacally. Salvi turned her head and stuck out her tongue as she scampered after the rest, reaching the entrance and exit of the dungeons. Peter gripped the bars of a cell, his head whipped to Salvi. You have the keys, haven't you? Get over here and unlock this cell. Manakel was already up, cradling his jaw. The sight of a kobold was nothing short of confusing. Salvi unlocked the gate and Peter flung it open.
Are you okay, Manakel?
He asked, practically yelling. Manakel smiled.
I'm fine, my boy. What was that horrible music?
He winced as he spoke, and was shocked when Peter suddenly hugged him, thin tears leaking from his eyes. Braum looked away. Salvi stared curiously. Branelkoff hadn't even looked in the first place. Manakel robbed Peter's back, then pushed him away, his eyes knowing and apologetic.
Come now. No time for that.
Peter wiped his eyes and nodded, putting on a strong face instead.
Manakel,
He began.
tell me everything. What is this all about? Of course, but in time.
Manakel walked out of the cage.
First, we must stop Duke Rondo, then I'll tell you everything.
Footsteps echoed from atop the stairs. Looks like we got company, Braum said. Branelkoff? Branelkoff sighed breezily.
Ah, if you insist.
He hoisted his lute to his chest and fingered the frets. Peter, Braum, and Salvi put all their hands to their ears. Cover your ears, Peter shouted to Manakel, and the music began. Tyndale Manor, the king of Mirth, sat in his throne, his dull, witless eyes sliding over the people gathered there. Dukes, lords, and clergymen, and everything in between, were lined up on either side of the throne, parting between the red rug that ran between. Their clothes were vibrant, brocade, with curling patterns that displayed their wealth extravagantly, and drew the eye. And yet, next to all the others, the clashing patterns could not help but seem garish. Councillors were lined up in the back, minor nobles were giving way to dukes, and palace officials standing off to the sides. Knights in striking ceremonial armour were stationed up and down the royal carpet, and at all corners of the room. The king babbled his lips like an infant seeking the teat. and a servant slipped a chalice of wine between his lips, while another wiped away his drool. The head councilman stepped forward, robed in red, his head wreathed in fern fronds. He welcomed everyone warmly, speaking of the importance of the event, as young boys in simple white shirts walked down the aisle, swinging censers of sweet-smelling smoke, as others flapped the air with clusters of pine needles, dipped in perfumed water. Rondo's eye twitched as a drop of scented water splashed his face. He forced a smile and decided he would remove all this ceremonial faffery once he was king. Some musicians were playing an incomprehensible tune, lest things became too boring, as members of the clergy cast benediction upon benediction over the ceremony. The fern-wreathed councilman raised his arms to the sky, his back to the throne and king. He spoke out with divine providence. Under the eye of God, in the absence of an heir of pure blood, today we are gathered here to choose the country's new king, to lead us into prosperity, to follow boldly in the footsteps as he marches us into brighter tomorrows, and over the bones of those who threaten us. Rondo's expression belied no interest, expectation, or emotion, as the councilman continued. You understand your impatience, for this day is long delayed, but it is not something to be decided so lightly. Long have we of the Meredith Council debated in secret, and this time was not wasted. For in our efforts, scouring the deeds and family line of each and every house, we discovered something that may come as a shock to some of you. The room held its collective breath as the councilman milked the moment for all it was worth. What we discovered was that the king has, in fact, a brother, a half-brother. Rondo nurtured himself on the shocked murmurs that swept across the room, and the sour expression that twisted Duke Denka's face. Tell us already, one of the nobles shouted from the safety of the crowd. The councilman gestured with open palms to pacify the crowd. King Tynedale gurgled in the background. That half-brother is none other than Duke Rondo. He gestured to the Duke, standing in the front of the crowd with a face of deceitful shock and disbelief. And by divine blood right, it is he who shall be our new king. Thus is the decision of the council, and thus all of the people of Meredith. The crowd erupted. Rondo stepped up to the councilman, across the long red carpet to the foot of the throne. He stared at the king, who seemed to stare back. He let a furtive smile creep upon his lips, and he basked in the outraged shouts raging around him. The guards fought to keep the crowd under control, racked with anxiety, as they suddenly found themselves more than mere ceremonial set pieces. Their efforts to hold them back were half-hearted and limp-wristed, in fear of the vindictive retribution of the nobility, they sought to contain. For the recompense of a single sprained limb could easily equate to their entire head. The rest of the councilmen rushed forth, blocking the crowd's advance as they demanded answers. It was only natural they suspected bribery and foul play. Noble houses suddenly discovering powerful ancestral ties was as common as summer rain. Whether it was to claim relations to an ancient hero in order to bolster the house's prestige, or to annul an inconvenient marriage by declaring it incestuous. Few were unaware of this particular tactic. They shouted for proof, casting their aspirations onto the council and royal courts.
Please,
the head councilman shouted.
Please settle down. Let us explain. We have good reasons for our decision.
Rondo looked innocent and incorruptible as the head councilman explained their findings to the crowd. The older nobles seemed mollified as the council recalled King Turnham's rape of the young scullery maid and her exile. The others seemed to read the expressions in the eyes of their elders, but still demanded proof.
We understand your skepticism,
the councilman announced.
This reaction was one we had foreseen, and we are well prepared to put all your doubts to rest.
He gestured towards the back of the room. A servant stepped forwards, carrying 2 glowing pendants atop a velvet pillow. Another wave of murmurs swept over the crowd. Several of the houses caught wind of the mysterious pendant that was making its way from Luhorn to Panas, and a select few recognized the pendant, at least one half of it, as it belonged to the king himself.
These,
the councilman picked up the pendant.
These were long thought to be lost. They once belonged to the king, and they are, as the court mage will testify, enchanted with magics, foreign to this land.
He held them out to the crowd, one in each hand, and none would deny it in the sight of that unnatural glow.
In the land of Kushu, these are called companion pendants. They always come in pairs, and, as you can see, they glow. Had they been apart, they would appear to be nothing more than regular gemstones, and would only begin to produce dim light when its companion is less than 20 leagues away, glowing brighter every step closer. They are popular amongst the queens of Kushu, to hold as they wait for their husbands to return. But these,
he shook them,
are special, tied directly to royal blood.
He held them up and pushed one into the other, making the 2 pendants appear whole for the first time in ages. But they slipped away.
These 2 can only be united by one of royal blood.
Let me see those,
Duke Denker demanded. The councilman tapped his foot once, an innocent signal, and caught Duke Rondo behind his neck in the corner of his eye. He smiled.
Of course. You can try for yourself, and you will find them quite impossible to unite.
Duke Denker took the pendants and pressed them together, twisting his lips as the smooth metal surfaces refused to interlock. He lifted them to his eye and scrutinized every curve and curl, searching for the hidden mechanism that would allow them to link together. The councilman watched patiently, all eyes on him. He stopped, looked around.
Out of my way,
he commanded brusquely, pushing the crowd aside. He stepped up to the throne, past Duke Rondo, who had to suppress his smirk, and up to King Tynedale. He looped the pendant around the witless king's neck. The foolish duke stood there, licking his lips as he worked up the courage. He pressed the pendant into its twin and let go. The pendant fell into the king's lap. Rondo stepped aside Denker and gracefully lifted up the fallen pendant. Denker knitted his brow in consternation as Rondo slid one jagged edge into the other. The king looked down in distant fear as the seam flashed with light. Rondo let his hand fall, and the pendant remained. The room was silent as a crypt, ages old. Rondo turned and spread his arms, as if to say, "What do you think of that?" Heads turned and shattered to their neighbors.
Wait!
Duke Denker shouted, stepping in front of Duke Rondo, slashing his hand through the air.
That does not prove anything. These pendants, they're enchanted, but by bloodline.
He played to the crowd.
Who's to say these pendants are not enchanted between Duke Rondo and King Tynedale alone? That does not prove his is of royal blood. That's right,
someone shouted from the crowd, and once again the room was abuzz with activity. The councilman stuttered, and the nobility in the crowd reacted like sharks reacted to blood.
Stop!
Rondo spoke for the first time.
If you are not convinced, why not try with someone else? Someone else?
Barked Denker.
If there was someone else, we would not have been stuck in this mess. King Turnham's remains are inside the palace catacombs, are they not?
He tilted his head. The crowd murmured, while others cried out in offence.
That's sacrilege. It is my only suggestion. Whether we do it is entirely up to you, my fair duke. If you think it's necessary, then drop your complaints and accept the decision of the council.
Duke Denker's face tightened. He grunted and turned.
Will bones work?
He asked the councilman, who nodded.
Then do it.
The council agreed and left the room, accompanied by Duke Denker, and it was an hour before they returned with the femur of the previous king. Rondo's father, Tynedale's father. Was there a glimmer of understanding in the old king's face as it was brought into the room? Perhaps. The femur was carried in cotton of purest white. Denka brought it to the king, and as he tried to separate the pendant, he found it wholly impossible. Rondo tore them apart as easily as separating lodestones. He could not suppress his smirk this time. Denka glowered. He hesitated to grab the old femur and looked away as he snatched it from the cloth. He pushed the pendant together and tapped it with the femur, and the seams sparked and glowed, sealing together. Denka looked at Rondo, but there were no more questions on his lips. He only walked away, defeated. Rondo took the pendant back and looped his half around his neck. Someone in the crowd cheered.
"And there you have it,"
said the head councilman. The others joined in, as if trying to compete for the favour of the new king. Rondo smiled as the other councilmen surrounded King Tyndale and stripped him of his crown. He grasped after it like an infant for their favourite doll, but he was too weak to stop them. Pure, organic pleasure coursed through his veins as he stood there, waiting for the crown to fall on his head. All his plans, his scheming, and here he was, king, king, king! There was nothing that could spoil this moment. Nothing except for that horrible noise. It was getting closer, closer. Rondo clasped his hands over his ears. The sound reverberated throughout the royal hall until there wasn't a man standing with open ears. Then it stopped, and the doors flew open. Rondo's eyes bulged out to see Manakel standing there with Peter at his side, accompanied by Felix von Cainhorn, with lute in his hands, and an unknown soldier. Then he saw it. The kobold. The kobold! He gritted his teeth until it seemed blood would shoot from his gums. His face grew redder than hot iron.
"Thank you, Rondo,"
shouted Manakel, and the whole crowd turned to see him. They gasped as if they had seen an apparition, and in some ways they had.
"Thank you for explaining everything. For now, it is impossible to deny." "Looks like we barely made it in time,"
whispered Braum.
"Why did we need to waste so much time washing up and finding new clothes?" "I'm not complaining,"
said Branelkoff, sporting a handsome puce petticoat with ruffled sleeves.
"Not my style, though."
He strummed his lute.
"Because we can't walk into the royal coronation looking like runaway slaves,"
Manakel whispered over his shoulder harshly.
"Yes, I am alive."
He spread his arms.
"In spite of our Duke's attempt to silence me, I am still alive."
He walked down the red carpet.
"Unfortunately, it seems I am a little late to the ceremony. Have you already explained where King Tyndale got that pendant?"
He looked at Rondo, then swept his gaze across the silent room.
"You haven't? Then allow me to explain.
He looked briefly to see Salvi dashing between the legs of nobles. He cleared his throat and tried his best to ignore it.
It was almost 20 years ago now, shortly after the death of his one and only son.
He looked remorseful.
Many of you remember our king's visit to the empire of Kushu. Some of you were even there with me, but all of you should recall the king's heartbreak. It seems like he would never love again, but he did. He did. It was during his liaison inside the imperial palace that he met Awen, one of the emperor's concubines. And yes, he was cold at first, but she was so sweet, and soon he laid with her.
The crowd dare not speak, only leaned in to listen as Manakel continued.
I was King Tyndall's only confidant in this, and sure as the sun rises in the east, he fell in love with her, but their time together was short. He begged the Empire of Kushu to let him take her with him, but he was a prideful man. He refused to part with any piece of his property, no matter how much Tyndale offered. Before leaving the Kushu Empire, it was then that he had those pendants fashioned and enchanted in the imperial towers. He gave one to Awen and promised to see her again. But leaving that country, that was what truly broke his heart for the last time.
Manakel looked at Peter and smiled. Peter looked at him curiously.
Shortly after the king's departure, Awen caught the horse disease. She was thrown out of the palace, in disgrace, and forced to work on the streets, even as her body was ravaged by scankers. But soon she gave birth. She gave birth to the king's son.
Disbelief swept over the crowd. Disbelief and hope.
The king has a son?
Shouted one, then another, then more, demanding to know, demanding Manakel to explain himself, demanding to know why he kept it a secret.
Yes, yes.
He waved his hands, and the crowd settled down.
The king has a son, and he lives. Where is he?
Someone shouted. Manakel continued without answering. His jaw flared with pain, but he dared not stop.
Awen loved her son dearly, and did everything she could for him. But her body simply broke down.
He shook his head.
It goes without saying, she couldn't care for him anymore. When he was 5, she was forced to send him away. She sold her beloved pendant to pay for the voyage and sent him far, far away. Someone like her son, she knew would have enemies. She worried how the king may react. So she sent him to someone else she thought she could trust. Someone she had met before.
Peter's eyes grew wide.
Me?
Manakel extended his opened palm to Peter, who stared in disbelief, but only for a moment. Then his face became rock solid, regal. I am the heir to Marith, Peter declared, and strode across the carpet, like he had belonged there all his life, and none dared to question it.
I have prepared him for this day since he was a child. I've taught him everything I know. He's clever, he is decisive, he's wise, and he is your rightful king."
"Him?"
Duke Rondo screeched.
This is preposterous." "The proof, Rondo,"
Manakel pointed.
"is around your neck. Any related by blood may unite them, but only Awen and Tyndale may open them, be it by their hands or by their blood combined."
Rondo clutched the pendant to his chest, eyes ablaze with dark fire. His rabid glare shot down anyone who approached. But his guilt was evident. The crowd advanced like an inexorable wave, hands groping, pulling the Duke down into its depths as they stripped the pendant from him. The mass receded, handing the pendant to Manakel, their eyes sharp, dubious, reminding him that their favor would be short-lived should he fail to convince them. Manakel lifted Awen's half of the pendant and held it to the sky.
"I'm truly sorry for deceiving you all this long. Especially you, Peter. But it would have been impossible to prove without this pendant. And finding it, tracking it down from vendor to vendor in foreign lands, it took me almost 15 years. But here it is."
He handed it to Peter.
"Go on, boy."
He smiled, for it would be the last time he called him that. Peter nodded. He took the pendant and walked to the throne with measured strides. He looked at the poor king's face, no trace of recognition hiding inside his smoky eyes. The feelings swimming through his chest, they were too numerous to count. He grabbed the king's pendant and looked up at Tyndale's eyes, staring into his. He almost jumped, but he stared back, his blue eyes deep into the king's aged eyes of the same color. Tyndale's face was wrinkled, weathered by years of anger, years of sorrow, and years of happiness as well. His hair was hoary and fragile like chalk, but Peter could not help but see the resemblance. His hands were bone-thin and nearly translucent. He raised them and grabbed Peter by both cheeks. They were cold. "Father," Peter whispered. The words felt strange on his lips, but in his heart he knew they were right. Tears leaked down from Tyndale's eyes. He smiled as best as he could. Peter covered the king's cold hands. Tyndale felt the warmth. He breathed and closed his eyes, and his head bent forward like a broken flower stem. Peter felt the king's hand go limp. They slipped away from Peter's cheeks and fell into his lap. He's dead," Peter breathed in disbelief. The king's attendants scrambled to his side and confirmed it. The crowd murmured, then was silent again. Heads bowed. The clergymen were wrapped in prayer. Peter stared into his father's face, and how peaceful it was. Peter grabbed the pendant. They united with a flash. He flipped the hidden compartment open as if he knew about it all his life, and inside was nothing more than a miniature painting of his mother and father, smiling. His eyes glistened, but that was all he would allow. He turned to Shears, restrained and dignified, as befitting nobility, but welcoming the new king all the same. He felt a regal coat draped over his shoulders and a crown placed upon his head, for the councilman had seen the writing on the wall.
Your mistake, Rondo,
Manakel said amidst the shears,
was too much planning. Had you simply done away with the amulet and found some other way to prove your bloodline, this would have been...
He turned, but Rondo was gone. The servant boys scattered petals into the air as the ceremony went on. From the back, Braum and Brandlcoff shared a look. Brandlcoff tried to join in with the musicians, but Braum stopped him just in time.
Salvi!
Peter called out amidst the celebrations.
Where's Salvi?
The nobles looked around, wondering who he was calling for. Salvi stepped into the center aisle. She was chewing on something. Peter could not begin to guess where she got it from.
This is Salvi.
He crouched down slightly to put his hand on her back, earning some scrutinizing gazes from the other nobles.
If it wasn't for her, we would never have made it here. Ain't you forgetting someone?
Brannelkoff shouted from the back. And Felix von Canehorn, Peter added. Some in the crowd sniggered as they recalled the name. And Braum? He paused.
Samsa. Braum Samsa. It's thanks to all them, but especially this one.
Salvi swallowed.
It seems I'm the king now.
Peter smiled confidently.
If there's anything I can give you as thanks, just name it.
Salvi screwed her finger into her lip in consideration.
Welcome to the University of Pendants.
The willowy, white-haired dean bowed, but still found himself taller than his guest.
Our lovely university is only second to the palace itself, as the crown jewel of not only Pendants, but the whole kingdom.
He spoke with pride. Even so, he could not seem to put his heart into it. But an order was an order. Salvi stood at the gate of the iron fence encompassing the campus grounds, and scanned the vacant greenery and well-maintained fields. The compound was split between 4 buildings. She wondered which one was hiding the university. She had 3 royal centuries as her bodyguards.
If you come this way, we will start with the first building of our fine university. Built over 300 years ago. It's...
Salvis stopped paying attention and followed him down the hedge-lined lane leading to the stone-carved building and its grand double doors. Students and professors walked in and out freely, stopping to stare at her, as she was the most interesting thing that had happened to them all day. She passed under the architrave and bent her head, trying to look in every direction at once. The dean mistook her wandering eyes as genuine interest and lectured her on the history of the building and the architectural techniques used in its construction.
And this is the library. It houses over...
Salvi looked up and down the endless rows of shelves that seemed to stretch into infinity. Librarians scooted up and down ladders, moving up and across shelves, 3 stories high. She wondered if it could be hidden inside. She pulled out one of the books and dangled it like a captured mouse, pages flapping in the breeze. The dean forced her to put it back, politely but firmly.
Here is our orrery. It is the most mechanically complex instrument inside our university. Our astrologers use it to calculate alignment of planets, to predict all sorts of things. It was originally built by...
If anything contained the university, it was this. She stood in the middle of a simulated night sky that filled the dome overhead. Intricate gears clicked and ticked, advancing each suspended celestial body imperceptibly in its orbit around the sun. She looked around excitedly, but couldn't find anything more than gears and planets.
Where is he?
Pardon?
Asked the dean.
Where is he? University,
She said empathically.
place human get smart.
You're inside the university right now.
He said, confused. She continued to repeat herself, making vague gestures.
You mean the universe?
He clasped his hand in understanding, unfortunately operating under the assumption that anything she was saying made sense.
You're inside the universe right now, or at least our model of it. There's so much we don't know, but...
She was inside it. Salvi looked around even harder, touching things the dean absolutely did not want her to touch, but still found nothing. She tugged her horns in frustration, then had a thought. They were still trying to hide it from her. Of course!
Hey, where are you going?
The dean shouted as Salvi dashed out the door and into the winding halls of the university. He chased after her, along with the 3 bodyguards. They caught the tip of her tail around the next corner. They rounded it, but she had disappeared. Around they ran, from building to building, interrupting classrooms and leaping into doors, chasing the phantoms of chaos she left behind in her wake. The dean leaned on his knees and panted, waving for the centuries to go on without him. It was an entire hour before they found her sitting in the fields, arms outstretched and eyes to the sky. She saw the dean approach and sat up.
Where is he?
She repeated again, meeker this time.
This is We don't.
He was at the limits of his patience, but frankly found himself perversely curious with what in the world she was trying to accomplish.
Explain to me exactly what you're looking for.
Through wriggling hands, spasmodic gestures, and stilted speech, he slowly began to understand exactly what she thought the university was. It was ridiculous, but the scholar in him was interested in the apparently incomprehensible way kobold brains worked.
This is the university. It's nothing magical. We do research and teach, among other things, but it's nothing like what you're thinking.
How human get smart, then?
She asked.
We're simply born that way, I suppose.
He shrugged.
Some are smarter than others. Some are dumber. I'd imagine kobolds are much the same way, are they not? Shall we not get smart?
Not magically, no. But this is a place of learning, after all. I understand you've done something great for the kingdom to earn the favor of the new king. I'm sure with enough effort we could...
Salvi turned around and walked straight to the exit. What a waste of time, she thought to herself, wondering what she should do next. Rondo rode hard through the rocky forests, scowling to himself. He would make them pay. He would make them all pay. They thought they had him defeated, but they could hardly imagine the true reach of his influence. Dark plots brewing inside his skull as he rode through day and night. Finally, he arrived, riding through the trees into the small opening at the mouth of the valley. An arrow whizzed through the air. His horse reared, pitching him to the ground as it struck the ground next to its hoof. Rondo picked himself up and ran further into the clearing. Several wagons were parked there, as golems walked in and out of an opening in the ground, loading the wagons piece by piece, like an army of ants. Egerton stood there, amidst the remains of his assassins. He saw Rondo and opened his arms invitingly. Rondo ran. Egerton's face turned to a baneful fire as he grabbed the disgraced duke's wrists and flipped him onto his back. He pressed his stiletto to Rondo's neck and shouted,
You bastard! You ruined everything! Yet you show yourself to me? You must be eager to die! Stop! Stop!
Rondo panted.
Help me overthrow them. I've got connections. We can, with your help. I've had my fill of your shit, Rondo.
He smiled eerily.
An important lesson in this business is knowing when to quit. You could have lived out the rest of your disgraceful life in exile, but instead you come to me to die.
The bloody whites of Rondo's eyes showed he strained to stare at a dagger pressed into his vulnerable flesh.
You!
Egerton clasped Rondo's mouth shut.
That is a problem with you nobles.
You think it's natural that people should care about what you have to say, even when you've got nothing left.
He leaned in close, his cold, emotionless eyes staring straight through, and it was only then that Rondo realized his mistake. Rondo closed his eyes. Beads of blood bubbled out from the scratch across his neck. Egerton was taking it slow, grinning, riding the wave of his all-natural high. Then he stopped.
What?
He growled. The ground shook, and the forest was filled with the thunder of hooves. Egerton stood up, and from the ground Rondo watched as an army of cavalry surrounded them, flying the colours of House Pharaohs, and he felt joy at the sight of the gleaming armour of Rupert Pharaohs as he appeared out of the circle. The end. There is an epilogue.